Section 5 is going to cover files and directories. Now, files are something that you will work with on a day-to-day basis. That's what you will, as a user, will interface with the most. And so it's important to know some things about files, such as how they're organized into directories. Directories are also referred to as folders, so whichever term you like to use, it's just a way to organize your files. Another real important concept to know about files is the path. You need to know how to get to that file, what path you take. Usually there's a top level directory such as the C: on a Windows box or the / root directory on a Linux box. From there, the path will guide you down to where the file actually resides. And it's really important to know that, because if you run a command and it can't run, you get an error, chances are either it can't find the application that it's supposed to run or the command, or it can't find the file that you're trying to work with. So understanding the path is a very important concept. We're going to talk about that. We'll also talk about file types and file permissions. Permissions are important from an information security standpoint, and working a little bit with files, and finally finding information relating to a file. So these are the things that will be covered in Section 5. We'll revisit this in a little bit more detail in Part C, but this is just an intro for a beginner level.
Although this section deals primarily with files, we need to understand how files are organized in the first place to be able to get to them. Now, files are organized in directories. The best way to visualize that organization is to think of a filing cabinet. So if you have a filing cabinet, you have one or more drawers. Within a drawer you have a folder, one or more folders, and within each folder you could have one or more paper files. On your computer, you start with your computer, and your computer has a hard disk. That hard disk is like a drawer. Within the hard disk you have directories, and then within directories or subdirectories you have files. Now on Windows, the drawer is like your C drive, or your C drive is like a drawer. So you start with the C drive, then you go down to your directory or subdirectory, and there could be several subdirectories here, and the last component is your file. Same thing on Linux, is your top level directory or drawer would be the /. And then you start with listing out the directories or your folders, and then the last component would be your file. Now, looking at the command line, the reason we call them directories is because one of the commands to see the contents of a folder or a directory is dir, so standing for directory. So if you type in that, you see that. But on the GUI side of things, they always look like folders. So if you look at the GUI interface, these look like little folders, and then you have your files inside. Same thing on Ubuntu or on Linux. The icon used to represent your files is like a little cabinet with some folders in there, and that's where you'd find your files. So all those terms are used interchangeably, directory and folder. I'm going to try to use the term directory as much as possible to be consistent. Now that we know how files are organized, it's important to talk about the file path, because the file path provides directions for how you navigate the directory structure to get to a file. So a couple key terms here are the top node and current working directory. The top node is where you start from, and the current working directory is where you're at. Now there's a couple ways to navigate through the directory structure on the command line interface, and that is with an absolute path or a relative path. Now quite honestly, using a GUI to navigate the directory structure is a lot easier. You just, to go up or down or wherever, you just double click on a directory or a folder, and you'll go right to that space or that place. In a command line interface, you actually have to do a lot more typing, and it's a little bit more cumbersome, but because we're going to spend a lot of time on the command line, I want to take some time here to go over that. So once again, we can navigate with a relative path, with an absolute path or a relative path. And an absolute path really just means typing out all the specifics. So you have to provide the top node and each directory or subdirectory to get you to the place that you want to be. one last note is in Windows, it doesn't handle spaces very well. So if you are going to provide a directory or subdirectory that has a space in it, such as My Documents, you'll probably have to enclose that whole path in double quotes. So the easiest way to do this is probably just to go to a command line and take a look. So we're going to assume that there's a subdirectory out there called C temp code, and in order to navigate there with an absolute path, we would do cd for change directory C temp code. So you can see we're providing specific directions on how to navigate from the top node down to the directory that we want to be, and we'll see that the command prompt changes once we do that. Now if we wanted to move up a directory, then we would have to provide the same. You can actually just shortcut that using our history command, and then we just we provide the absolute path from the top node down to the directory here. So when we do that, we see that we've moved from the code subdirectory up one level to the temp directory. Now if we wanted to navigate using a relative means, we would do cd, and then this dot backslash means this is where we're at right now. This is our current working directory, and we want to move down into the code directory. And so we see that we've moved from the temp down into the code directory. Now to move back up using relative means, we use cd dot backslash. Now this would take us from the code directory or subdirectory up a level. Now if we added another one, this would indicate that we'd go up 2 levels. So we'd go from the code directory to the temp to the C, and if we do that here, we see that's indeed where we end up. So again, if something doesn't work, you might want to use an absolute path to specifically tell your computer where to find a file or a command. And finally, one last note to help you save a little bit of typing. Sometimes it varies in command lines, but if you do, like say a cd and then you type in the first character or two, cd-t, and then hit the tab key, it will autocomplete. So that could save you some time in typing. So those are just a couple things to be aware of. And the next thing we'll talk about are the file types. Before moving on to file types, there are a couple differences that I wanted to point out between Windows and Linux. The first is that the separator we use between directories and subdirectories in Windows is a backslash, and in Linux it's a /. In Windows, Windows is case insensitive, so you can type in cd upper lowercase temp and you'll get there. You can type in cd lowercase temp and you'll get there, and you can type in cd all uppercase temp and you'll get there. However, in Linux, if I try typing in cd upper lowercase, I'll get an error. If I try typing in cd all caps, I won't get there. But if I type in cd temp, it will change directories down into temp, because it's all lowercase. So those are a couple things to be aware of in between Windows and Linux, is the separator and the case sensitivity. Now let's talk about file types. There are many files on your computer, and one way to categorize or organize them is with a file extension or a file type. So a lot of times at the end of a file name, you'll see something like a 3 or 4 character indication that it's a .txt, .exe, .docx, whatever. That would indicate what file type it is. And the other thing to note about that is those file types are often associated with an application. So if you typed on a file name that ended in, say, docx, it would automatically start the Microsoft Word application. Now, one thing that in Windows at least, one thing to note is that that file extension is not always enabled by default. Sometimes you have to go into Control Panel and then Appearance and Personalization, File Explorer Options, and View. And down here, this hide extensions for known file types is often checked. So let me show you what that looks like in the directory structure. You'll see this file here. It has a file name. It's a text document, but it's not showing the extension. Now if I go over here and I uncheck that, so I don't want to hide the extensions anymore, I apply and OK. Okay, so see, when I had that checked, that was hidden, and I hit apply. Now I uncheck it, hit apply again, and now you can see that the file extensions are showing. So that's just something to be aware of, and I typically like to see what file type it is because I like to have that information. So anyways, that's something to be aware of. Number one, that files are a lot of times grouped or categorized or identified by the file extension, which indicates the file type, and that file type is often associated with an application that would start up if you double-clicked on that file. The next topic we want to discuss about files is file permissions. Now, file permissions are a way to implement security so that you can give certain access to some people but not others. And so the basic permissions, or sometimes they're called modes, but the basic permissions are read, write, and execute. Now you can assign any one of those three to several different groups, and the main groups are, number one, the file owner or the creator of the file, and number two would be a group that you create, and then number three would be everybody else. So this is it's easier to see this in Linux. So let's open up Ubuntu, and we're going to do an ls-l, which is a long listing, and we're going to only look for text files. So that's why we're going to grep.txt. And what we see out here is this set of characters. Now, the first character will tell you if it's a directory or a file, so we're not going to worry about that as far as permissions go right now. But the next three characters indicate the permissions for the owner, and the owner is designated here as Derek. The second group of three characters are the permissions for the group. The group happens to be the same name as the owner, but this would be a group name and this could be different. The final three characters are for the public group, or basically anybody else. So if you're not the owner and you're not part of the Derek group, then these last three permissions would apply to you. Now in this case, the owner has read, write, and execute. The group has read, write, and execute, but everybody else only has read, which means they couldn't write to the file. And again, this is a way that you can implement security to allow people to do certain things with some files or nothing at all. If there were three dashes here, then people who were outside of the owner and the group couldn't even see the file. So that's one way to implement security. Now on Windows, let's take a look at a file, say file1.txt. If we right click it and go to properties and then to the security tab, you'll see Windows operates a little bit differently, where you could have several different users or groups listed in this window, and then when you click on one of those, you'll see the corresponding permissions below. So here's the object that's the focus. It's file1.txt. We can choose, say, users. This would be any user on this computer, and we could see that they have read and execute and read permissions, but not write. So you can modify those as needed. Now the last thing I want to talk about is the permissions that you can apply to a file. You can also apply to a folder. So if you had the temp, let's see, if you click the temp folder or directory here and click properties and go to the security tab, you can see a similar setup where you have what you're focusing on, the directory temp, and then you have a set of groups or users, and then the corresponding permissions, and you can see what each group or user can do. So that's all I had for file permissions, but it is very important if you're going to work in information security or be assistant administrator, you want to make sure that certain files are not accessible to everybody because it could contain sensitive information, and you want to be able to protect that, and file permissions is one way to do that. This exercise for Section 5, working with files, is kind of long. Now there's 4 different ways you can do this. You could go through Windows using the command line or the GUI, or Linux using the command line or GUI. I'm going to run through Windows just on the command line, running through each of the steps that I mentioned previously. So you can either follow this or you can just do this on your own, but I just wanted to walk through it so you'd have some reference of seeing all these commands actually take place. So I guess here we go. So the first step was to make a directory. So mkdir. And in this case, we're going to use the absolute path. We're already in the temp directory, but we're going to make a directory 2 here. Okay, and now we can add a file. So let's go ahead and cd to that directory. Again, we can just use just type in the first letter or 2, hit tab, and it'll autocomplete. Now we're going to add a file, and we're going to add a file using the echo command. The echo command is available in Windows and Linux. Nothing too fancy. We're just telling it to echo what we typed here between the double quotes, and we're putting it into a file. And again, we'll use the absolute path. Okay. Now let's view the contents of this directory. We can do that with the dir or directory command, and here we see the file we just made, file2.txt. Alright, one other thing that might be aware of is some files are hidden by default, and so there's commands that you can use to see that the file, if it happens to be hidden. That's a little bit beyond the scope of this course, but just be aware that if you do a directory or a listing, that some files may be hidden. Okay, now we've viewed the contents. Now let's view the file contents, and we do that with the more command. Again, since we're in the directory, we could just type more file2.txt, and we see what we had typed up there. Okay. Now let's move a file. So now that we see the file, we're going to move it, and in this case we'll just move it up a directory. So let's use the move command, and I'll give it absolute file paths this time. And then the destination is going to be C temp. And then this, we'll use the same file name. You could give it a different file name, but we'll use the same. Okay. I didn't call it dir2. Okay, so now it says one file moved. So if you want to check that, let's do a directory again, and we see that we don't have that file in here. We're in the temp dir2 directory, and that file is no longer there. But if we move up a directory, cd ... /, we're in the temp directory. Now we should see file 2 here. Okay. Now the next thing is we're going to copy a file. So we can do that by typing copy, and I'll use absolute paths again. And in this case, see, before we moved the file, so it actually removed it from one directory and put it in another. In this case, we're going to copy, so it's going to keep
the file in the temp directory, but it's also going to make a copy of it in the temp dir2 directory. So we're actually going to have two copies of the file now. So it copies successful. So if we do a dir, we're going to see file 2 here. And if we change directory to dir2 and do a directory listing, we see it's also here. So it's in two places now because we copied it. Okay, we can also rename the file, and we use the rename command. A lot of these are just make sense, so it's not too hard to remember the commands. So since we're already in the directory, I'll just name file2.txt to, we'll call it 2a. Now because I'm not telling it where I'm getting it from or where I'm putting it to, it's going to just assume that I'm in the same directory. So now you see that it's file2.txt, and now if I do a directory again, you'll see it's file2a.txt because that's what I copied it to. Now to edit the file, you can use Notepad. So in that case, you'd want to just, I guess you'd have to go out here, type in Notepad. It's a small text editor. And then File, Open, and we will navigate down to C, temp, directory 2. Here's our file. We open it, and then we can do whatever we want. We can just type something. File, save, and then we can close it. And now if we do a more on file2a.txt, we see that it's been changed to try something or type something. So now we're going to delete a file. So we can delete, I guess we can go ahead and delete this file. So we can say del, and then we could either give the absolute path, but since we're in the directory already, we can just say file2a.txt. Now if we do a directory listing again, we see that it's gone. Okay, so sometimes that doesn't mean that it's gone forever, because especially if you're in the GUI and you delete something, it more than likely will put it in the recycle bin. So if you do make a mistake in deleting a file, check the recycle bin. If you make this mistake while you're typing or some other commands, sometimes a Control-Z will undo an action. So if you accidentally make a mistake by deleting something, whether it's a file or something that you're typing, a document you're typing in, try Control-Z or look in the recycle bin for the file. Now, if you want to run through this exercise again in Linux, it's very much the same steps, very much the same commands. You can also try using the GUI to do this, to move and copy files. Typically in the GUI, you'd want to right click on the file, and then you can choose from the top pop-up menus different things. So a little bit long of an exercise, but I just want to make sure that you are comfortable with these types of skills.